Welcome. You are invited to rest your mind and listen quietly to a slow journey through time. Tonight, it will be observed that the subject of reflection is ancient China, and more particularly, the Shang Dynasty, which existed long ago, between approximately 1600 and 1046 years before the Common Era. The purpose of this session is not to excite, not to awaken curiosity, but to provide a calm, detailed description of how people lived, worked, and governed in that early period. You may allow the words to flow slowly, as if they are passing by like water in a quiet river. Nothing urgent will happen, and nothing will be concluded quickly. The world of the Shang Dynasty will simply unfold, gently and steadily. It is understood that the Shang Dynasty was one of the earliest known organized states in Chinese history. It emerged after the semi-legendary Xia Dynasty, and it preceded the Zhou. It was observed that during this long stretch of time, the early structures of Chinese civilization began to form. The people of the Shang built towns and cities, raised crops, made tools of bronze, worshipped their ancestors, and used a system of writing that later evolved into the Chinese script still known today. The landscape was dominated by the Yellow River, also called the Huanghe. Its waters were thick with silt, a fine yellow earth that made the land fertile, yet it also brought floods. Life near the river was repetitive and predictable, planting, harvesting, rebuilding after floods, and then planting again. It was a slow rhythm, a pattern repeated by countless families whose names are long forgotten. These people were farmers, artisans, and servants of the state. Their lives moved in cycles that did not vary much from year to year. It will be explained that the Shang kings ruled not only through political authority but also through religion. They believed that the spirits of their ancestors communicated with them, and they asked those spirits for guidance. Decisions about war, weather, and harvests were made after consulting oracle bones, pieces of bone or turtle shell that were heated until they cracked. The patterns of the cracks were interpreted as messages from the spirit world. This was a slow and deliberate process, performed carefully and without haste. The purpose of this narration is to create a calm space in which history may be absorbed without pressure. Each fact will be given time. Each sentence will arrive and pass at its own pace. The listener is not expected to remember every name or date. The listener is invited only to drift through the sounds of ancient life, the sound of water on soil, the sound of bronze being hammered, the sound of quiet prayers rising in temple air. As you hear about fields, and tools, and rituals, it may be felt that this civilization was not so distant. Its rhythm was steady, its people patient, its nights long and silent. The Shang Dynasty was not a story of drama or conquest, but of continuity and order. And so, this evening, we will walk slowly through its memory, step by step, word by word, until calm returns, and the mind begins to rest. It was observed that the Shang Dynasty developed upon the broad and gently sloping plains of northern China, most notably along the middle and lower reaches of the Yellow River. The Yellow River, also known as the Huanghe, was sometimes called China's sorrow, not because of any emotional quality, but because of the frequent floods that occurred along its course. Its waters, dense and opaque with yellow silt, would overflow and reshape the landscape. Yet, this same silt made the soil fertile, suitable for early agriculture. In that way, the river both destroyed and sustained life. It provided the material for the civilization to grow, while at the same time demanding constant labor and maintenance. The terrain in the Shang heartland was largely flat, though it was occasionally interrupted by low hills and ridges. It was noted that the plains were formed by the slow deposit of loess, a fine, wind-blown dust that created a soft and easily cultivated earth. Because the soil was loose, people could dig channels and pits with simple tools made of wood, bone, and bronze. It was also discovered that this soil was easily eroded, and so embankments were built to contain the river. The people of the Shang did not build for beauty or grandeur, but for necessity. Each construction served a clear, repeated purpose: to keep the water steady, to protect the crops, and to preserve the rhythm of life. The Yellow River Basin experienced distinct seasons. Winters were cold and dry, summers warm and humid. It was recorded that most of the rainfall came between June and September, when the monsoon winds brought moisture from the sea. The farmers learned, through observation rather than theory, when to plant and when to harvest. The timing of the seasons was memorized and transmitted orally. A year was measured not by numbers but by cycles: the greening of the fields, the ripening of millet, the drying of stalks, and the fall of leaves. Settlements were typically established near the river or along smaller tributaries. These settlements were not large cities in the modern sense but collections of walled enclosures surrounded by farmlands. The walls were built using a technique known as rammed earth construction. This process involved placing moist soil into wooden frames and striking it repeatedly with wooden or stone tools until it was compacted into dense layers. The work was repetitive, rhythmic, and slow. The tapping of rammers could be heard for hours, creating a monotonous echo across the plains. The completed walls were sturdy, lasting for centuries if maintained. It is believed that the same method was used later to build parts of larger fortifications, showing how early habits became long-lasting traditions. Inside the walls, the arrangement of houses followed a practical order. The homes of nobles and rulers occupied raised platforms, while common dwellings were dug partly into the ground for insulation. The floors of these pit houses were lined with compacted earth, sometimes covered with straw or reed mats. Roofs were made of thatch supported by wooden beams. The design was simple, efficient, and suited to the available resources. The air inside remained cooler in summer and warmer in winter. In this way, architecture was shaped by geography and climate, not by aesthetic ambition. Beyond the settlement stretched the fields. It was noted that millet was the principal crop, though barley and wheat were also grown. Rice was rare in the north at this time but existed further south. The soil was turned with wooden plows tipped with bronze blades. Oxen or human labor provided the force. Irrigation canals brought water from the river to the fields, and dikes prevented the overflow. Farming was the central rhythm of Shang life. It governed work, ritual, and even social hierarchy. Land was not owned in the modern sense but allocated by the ruler, who controlled the distribution of farmland as part of his authority. Animals were also part of the geography of life. Pigs, dogs, and chickens were domesticated. Cattle were raised for both food and labor. Horses appeared later and were rare at first. Hunting provided some meat, though it was not a daily practice. The surrounding forests contained deer, wild boar, and smaller animals. Each hunt was done carefully, with bronze-tipped spears or bows. The hunters observed the same landscapes as the farmers: rivers, trees, open plains, but their rhythm of life was less predictable, guided by the movement of animals and the changing of seasons. It has been recorded that the Shang people were closely tied to their environment. They did not separate human life from natural processes. The river was not only a source of water but also a divine force. It was worshipped in rituals meant to ensure stability. The mountains in the distance were seen as the dwelling places of ancestral spirits. The fields, forests, and winds were part of a single order of existence, in which every cycle of nature had meaning. This belief shaped their behavior toward the land. When floods came, they rebuilt quietly. When droughts occurred, they performed offerings, not in desperation but as duty. The materials found in Shang sites confirm this closeness to nature. Stone and clay were used widely. Timber was abundant and served as beams, supports, and posts. Clay was used not only for pottery but also for molds in bronze casting. The soil, when tamped, became walls, when shaped, became vessels, when mixed with straw, became bricks. Nothing in the geography was wasted. It was a self-contained world, balanced between need and supply. Archaeologists have observed that the layout of Shang capitals, such as Zhengzhou and Anyang, reflected both environmental and political considerations. The palace complexes were placed on higher ground to avoid floods, while workshops and burial sites were located nearby but at lower levels. Bronze workshops were often close to water sources, needed for cooling molds and washing materials. The field stretched outward from the city boundaries, arranged in orderly divisions that followed the contours of the land. Transportation was slow but consistent. The river served as a natural route for movement. Small boats carried goods and materials between settlements. Over land, ox carts moved along packed earth paths. These routes were not paved but were firm from years of use. Travel was not hurried, time was not measured in hours but in the progress of distance covered. The movement of people and goods was part of the quiet pulse of Shang geography. The environment, in its totality, defined the Shang world. There were no vast deserts nearby, no mountain ranges cutting through the land. It was a broad and workable terrain, suited for the gradual growth of human organization. The Yellow River, despite its unpredictability, remained the central artery. Its banks were dotted with small settlements, temples, workshops, and fields. The air was filled with the smell of tilled earth and smoke from cooking fires. The pace of life was determined by the geography itself, a slow, continuous balance of labor, ritual, and rest. In conclusion, it may be said that the Shang dynasty's land and geography were not merely settings for human activity, but participants in it. Every wall, every plowed field, every flooded bank was part of the ongoing conversation between people and place. The landscape shaped their habits, their beliefs, and their technologies. The river's flow became the measure of time, and the soil became the substance of continuity. It was observed that the social structure of the Shang dynasty followed a clear and unchanging hierarchy, reflecting both political power and religious authority. Society was organized in layers, from the king at the top to the enslaved laborers at the bottom. Each class had its duties, rights, and restrictions, which were not often questioned. This order provided stability, ensuring that each person knew their place in a pattern that remained steady for centuries. At the apex of this structure stood the king, known as the Wang. The king's role was not limited to governance. He was the chief priest, the link between the human world and the spirit realm. It was believed that he could communicate with ancestors and deities, asking them for guidance in matters of war, weather, and harvest. This dual authority, political and religious, gave the king immense control. His words were considered sacred, and his decisions final. The king presided over ceremonies, distributed land to nobles, and commanded armies when needed. His power was both divine and practical, rooted in ritual as much as in law. Below the king were the nobles and the aristocratic families. They were often related to the royal line or rewarded through loyalty and service. Nobles managed territories granted by the king. These lands were not owned privately in the modern sense, but held in trust to produce food, labor, and tribute for the central court. The nobles maintained their own small courts, supported by warriors and servants. They lived in houses of rammed earth and wood, with slightly more comfort than commoners but governed by the same cycles of work and ritual. The warriors formed another important group within this structure. They were skilled in the use of bronze weapons such as axes, spears, and arrowheads. They defended the realm, participated in campaigns, and maintained order within local territories. Their social standing depended on proximity to the king and success in battle. Unlike later Chinese dynasties, the Shang military was not large or professional. It was mobilized when needed and dissolved afterward. Nevertheless, the presence of bronze weapons and chariots in royal tombs indicates that military prestige was highly valued. Beneath the nobles and warriors were the artisans. These individuals played an essential role in the production of tools, weapons, and ritual objects. It was noted that artisans often lived near palace or temple complexes, where workshops were located. Their work was specialized, passed down through generations. Bronze workers, potters, jade carvers, and weavers all contributed to the stability of the economy. Bronze artisans, in particular, held a respected but controlled position. The bronze casting process was considered sacred, as it was used to produce ritual vessels that connected the living to the spirits. Each piece required patience, precision, and repetitive labor. The majority of the Shang population, however, were farmers. They were the foundation of society, producing the food that sustained everyone above them. Their days were dictated by the agricultural calendar. They rose before dawn, tended the fields, cared for animals, and maintained irrigation systems. Taxes were paid in grain or labor. It was common for farmers to work part of the year on royal projects such as city walls or tombs. These duties were performed as obligations rather than choices. The farmers lived in simple dwellings, pit houses with thatched roofs, and ate a plain diet of millet porridge, vegetables, and occasionally meat. At the bottom of society were the enslaved people. They were usually prisoners of war or individuals punished for crimes. Their labor was used in construction, farming, and sometimes as sacrificial offerings in religious ceremonies. The lives of these people were rarely recorded. Yet, archaeological evidence from tombs indicates that many were buried alongside their masters, a sign of their perceived role as eternal servants even after death. This practice, though harsh, was accepted as part of the natural order. Family structure mirrored this larger social hierarchy. The family was considered the smallest but most important unit of society. The father held authority, followed by the eldest son, then younger children. Women had specific duties, managing the household, weaving textiles, preparing food, and participating in ancestor worship. While women had little political power, they played a vital role in the maintenance of ritual life. In some royal tombs, queens and consorts are buried with significant offerings, suggesting that women of high rank held spiritual influence even if their names were not often recorded. Clan identity was central to Shang society. Each clan traced its origins to a common ancestor, often mythologized as a spirit protector. Clan symbols, or totems, were used to mark possessions, vessels, and documents. These symbols evolved into early Chinese characters. The connection between writing, ancestry, and authority was strong. A clan's strength depended on its relationship to the royal family. Clans provided soldiers, workers, and tribute in exchange for protection and favor. Religion and governance were intertwined. The king's authority was justified by his ability to perform rituals correctly and maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and ancestors. If floods or famines occurred, it was believed that ritual mistakes had been made or the ruler had lost virtue. The cycle of faith and power reinforced the social hierarchy, obedience ensured stability, and stability ensured divine favor. The Shang also practiced a form of tribute economy. Goods such as grain, bronze, and jade were collected by the central government and redistributed. This system ensured that resources flowed toward the capital, supporting artisans and priests who served the state. Trade existed but was limited to neighboring regions. Goods were exchanged through barter, grain for jade, bronze for livestock. There was no currency, only the measured exchange of one necessity for another. The social structure was preserved through repetition and tradition. Children inherited their parents' occupations. Artisans trained their offspring. Farmers continued to farm the same lands. Nobles passed down their territories. There was little upward mobility, but also little disruption. This consistency gave the Shang society its enduring stability. It was noted that law and punishment were also part of this structure. Though few written laws survive, oracle bone inscriptions suggest that crime and judgment were overseen by local lords under royal authority. Punishments varied from fines to forced labor or death. The purpose of justice was not reform but restoration of order. The same logic applied in religion. Mistakes were corrected through offerings, not apologies. The balance of the world had to be maintained through action, not emotion. Cultural expression was subtle within this hierarchy. Music and ritual dance were performed at court ceremonies, often using bronze bells and drums. The melodies were slow, repetitive, and formal. Every movement had symbolic meaning. Such performances reinforced the structure of power, each sound, each gesture reminding participants of their place within the cosmic order. In conclusion, it may be said that the society of the Shang Dynasty was neither restless nor revolutionary. It was steady, hierarchical, and deeply ritualized. Every layer supported the one above it. Every duty was defined. The people lived within a carefully maintained pattern that valued continuity over change. The social order mirrored the order of the universe, with the king at the center, the nobles around him, and the common people forming the foundation below. It was a world of quiet obedience and deliberate rhythm, a society where stability was both the goal and the measure of success. It was observed that the Shang king, or Wang, occupied a position that combined governance, religion, and ritual authority in a single, unbroken role. Unlike later dynasties, where bureaucratic systems became more complex and specialized, the Shang system centered almost entirely around the person of the king. His power flowed outward through family, allies, and appointed nobles. It was a form of rule that depended as much on religious belief as on administrative organization. The king was seen not merely as a man, but as the intermediary between humans and the spirit world. It was believed that only through him could communication occur with the ancestors who guided the destiny of the people. The Shang ruler governed from a capital city, which moved several times over the centuries but was always established near fertile land and reliable water sources. Archaeological evidence from the site of Anyang, believed to be the last Shang capital, reveals a carefully planned center of authority. There were palace foundations, workshops, ritual altars, and royal tombs. The king resided in the palace complex, which served not just as a home but as an administrative and spiritual command center. Officials, priests, diviners, and scribes worked nearby, forming a small but efficient network of authority. Government under the Shang was personal rather than institutional. The king was the source of all decisions. His court functioned through direct orders, oral communication, and written records inscribed on oracle bones or bronze vessels. There were no formal departments as seen in later dynasties. Instead, tasks were distributed among nobles, relatives, and trusted advisors. These individuals acted as local governors, military commanders, or ritual supervisors, depending on their rank and ability. Their loyalty was ensured by kinship ties, religious obligation, and the constant reaffirmation of the king's divine connection. It was observed that the Shang king, or Wang, occupied a position that combined governance, religion, and ritual authority in a single, unbroken role. Unlike later dynasties, where bureaucratic systems became more complex and specialized, the Shang system centered almost entirely around the person of the king. His power flowed outward through family, allies, and appointed nobles. It was a form of rule that depended as much on religious belief as on administrative organization. The king was seen not merely as a man, but as the intermediary between humans and the spirit world. It was believed that only through him could communication occur with the ancestors who guided the destiny of the people. The Shang ruler governed from a capital city, which moved several times over the centuries but was always established near fertile land and reliable water sources. Archaeological evidence from the site of Anyang, believed to be the last Shang capital, reveals a carefully planned center of authority. There were palace foundations, workshops, ritual altars, and royal tombs. The king resided in the palace complex, which served not just as a home but as an administrative and spiritual command center. Officials, priests, diviners, and scribes worked nearby, forming a small but efficient network of authority. Government under the Shang was personal rather than institutional. The king was the source of all decisions. His court functioned through direct orders, oral communication, and written records inscribed on oracle bones or bronze vessels. There were no formal departments as seen in later dynasties. Instead, tasks were distributed among nobles, relatives, and trusted advisors. These individuals acted as local governors, military commanders, or ritual supervisors, depending on their rank and ability. Their loyalty was ensured by kinship ties, religious obligation, and the constant reaffirmation of the king's divine connection. It was through divination that the king made many important decisions. The process, as recorded on oracle bones, was slow, deliberate, and filled with ritual meaning. Questions were carefully prepared and inscribed using a bronze stylus onto ox scapulae or turtle shells. The inscriptions followed a standard form, mentioning the date, the diviner's name, the topic, and sometimes the anticipated outcome. The bones were then heated until cracks appeared. The pattern of these cracks was examined and interpreted as the response of ancestors or deities. The results were carved onto the same bones, creating permanent records of both the question and the divine answer. These inscriptions represent the earliest known form of Chinese writing and the earliest administrative records in East Asia. Through these divinations, matters of state were handled with patience and solemnity. The questions asked reveal much about the concerns of the Shang rulers. They inquired about the timing of harvests, the outcomes of battles, the causes of illness, and the meanings of natural events like eclipses or floods. The very act of divination demonstrated the unity of religion and governance. To rule effectively was to interpret correctly. The cracks on a bone could determine the movement of armies, the construction of buildings, or the offering of sacrifices. The Shang king also acted as a military leader. Warfare was an extension of his divine role, meant to maintain cosmic order and secure earthly stability. When neighboring tribes or rival states threatened the borders, the king would consult the ancestors before engaging in battle. Armies were composed of noble-led units, equipped with bronze weapons and chariots drawn by horses. Victories were celebrated with rituals of thanksgiving, while defeats were analyzed through further divination. The spoils of war, often including prisoners, were dedicated to the ancestors. Some captives were sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies, reinforcing the sacred purpose of military conquest. Taxation and tribute formed another aspect of administration. The Shang state depended on a steady flow of goods, grain, livestock, textiles, and bronze, from its territories. Tribute was collected from allied clans and neighboring groups, who sent offerings to the capital as signs of submission. These offerings were stored, redistributed, or used in ritual. Because there was no standardized currency, all exchanges were in kind. This system required record-keeping, which was done by scribes who wrote on bamboo slips, wooden tablets, or bones. It was through such records that the king maintained control over distant lands and ensured that obligations were fulfilled. The scribes of the Shang court were vital to administration. Their task was quiet but precise. They recorded divinations, tributes, population counts, and ritual inventories. The script they used consisted of pictographic and ideographic symbols, early ancestors of modern Chinese characters. Each sign was carved with care, often taking considerable time to complete. The process itself had ritual value, as writing was seen as an act that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. To inscribe a name or question was to give it permanence and acknowledgement before the ancestors. Local governance followed the same pattern as the central court. Nobles were granted authority over territories and were responsible for collecting tribute, enforcing order, and performing local rituals. These nobles ruled from fortified settlements, where they acted as extensions of the royal will. They could mobilize farmers and artisans for public works, such as the construction of walls, roads, or irrigation canals. In return, they retained a portion of the produce and maintained their social standing. The relationship between the king and his nobles was one of mutual dependence, reinforced through ritual gifts and marriage. It was also observed that the Shang rulers used religion to legitimize their power. The king was said to have been chosen by the ancestors themselves, and divine approval was demonstrated through successful harvests and victories. When natural disasters occurred, they were interpreted as signs of ancestral displeasure. In such cases, additional sacrifices were offered. Animals, wine, and sometimes humans were given to restore balance. The idea that the king's virtue maintained harmony between heaven and earth was central to the political system. This concept would later evolve into what became known as the Mandate of Heaven during the Zhou period, but its roots were firmly established in the Shang belief system. The tombs of Shang kings provide insight into their administrative and religious functions. At Anyang, royal tombs were large pits lined with wooden chambers. Inside were placed bronze vessels, jade ornaments, weapons, and chariots. Human and animal sacrifices were arranged carefully around the burial chamber. These tombs reflected not only the wealth and status of the rulers but also the administrative coordination required to build them. Each tomb was a project involving hundreds of workers, artisans, and officials, a demonstration of the organized labor that the state could command. Communication between the capital and distant territories was maintained through messengers and tribute missions. There were no written letters as in later periods. Instead, oral messages were delivered by trusted envoys. These journeys were slow, taking days or weeks, and followed established routes along rivers and valleys. The reliability of these routes allowed the king's authority to extend far beyond the palace walls, binding scattered communities into a single cultural and political framework. It was also observed that the Shang rulers used religion to legitimize their power. The king was said to have been chosen by the ancestors themselves, and divine approval was demonstrated through successful harvests and victories. When natural disasters occurred, they were interpreted as signs of ancestral displeasure. In such cases, additional sacrifices were offered. Animals, wine, and sometimes humans were given to restore balance. The idea that the king's virtue maintained harmony between heaven and earth was central to the political system. This concept would later evolve into what became known as the Mandate of Heaven during the Zhou period, but its roots were firmly established in the Shang belief system. The tombs of Shang kings provide insight into their administrative and religious functions. At Anyang, royal tombs were large pits lined with wooden chambers. Inside were placed bronze vessels, jade ornaments, weapons, and chariots. Human and animal sacrifices were arranged carefully around the burial chamber. These tombs reflected not only the wealth and status of the rulers but also the administrative coordination required to build them. Each tomb was a project involving hundreds of workers, artisans, and officials, a demonstration of the organized labor that the state could command. Communication between the capital and distant territories was maintained through messengers and tribute missions. There were no written letters as in later periods. Instead, oral messages were delivered by trusted envoys. These journeys were slow, taking days or weeks, and followed established routes along rivers and valleys. The reliability of these routes allowed the king's authority to extend far beyond the palace walls, binding scattered communities into a single cultural and political framework. In conclusion, the administration of the Shang Dynasty may be described as personal, sacred, and orderly. Power flowed from the king, through his relatives and nobles, to the common people. Religion was the foundation of governance, and governance was the expression of religion. There were no parliaments, no bureaucracies, only layers of responsibility built upon loyalty and ritual. Every decision passed through divination. Every act of rule was framed by ceremony. The result was a slow but enduring system that maintained balance across centuries, a quiet, methodical governance shaped by belief, sustained by tradition, and remembered through the silent permanence of carved bones and buried bronzes. It was observed that one of the most characteristic and enduring features of the Shang dynasty was its mastery of bronze technology. The Shang people did not view bronze merely as a useful metal for tools and weapons. It was also an object of reverence, a material through which both practical and spiritual life were expressed. Bronze was used in warfare, ritual, and daily utility, and its production represented one of the most sophisticated technological achievements of its time. The development of bronze working in Shang society was gradual and methodical. It began with the discovery that copper, when combined with a small proportion of tin, created a harder and more durable alloy. This alloy could be melted and poured into molds, forming weapons, vessels, and ornaments that were stronger than stone and more reliable than pure copper. The knowledge of this process was not widespread among the population but confined to trained artisans working under state supervision. Their craft was considered sacred, and their workshops were often located close to royal or temple precincts. The method of bronze production followed a repetitive and organized sequence. First, the ores had to be obtained. It was recorded that copper and tin were not equally distributed in the Shang heartland, therefore, the raw materials had to be mined and transported from distant regions. Mining was done manually using simple tools, wooden handles with stone or bronze tips, and the ore was carried in baskets. The journey from mine to workshop could take many days, and each stage of transportation required careful coordination. It was not a hasty process but a measured, consistent flow of materials from one point to another. When the ore reached the workshop, it was smelted in clay furnaces heated by charcoal. The temperature had to be carefully maintained. Air was blown through narrow tubes made of clay, using bellows operated by hand or foot. The sound of the air rushing and the fire crackling created a constant rhythm, marking the pulse of the foundry. The molten bronze was poured into prepared molds. These molds were made from clay, and their creation was itself an intricate task. The most common method was known as piece mold casting. In this technique, a model of the desired object was made in clay, covered with another layer of clay to form a shell, and then separated once dry. The inner core was removed, and molten bronze was poured into the space between the outer mold and the inner core. When the bronze cooled, the mold was broken apart, revealing the finished object. This process required patience and precision. The molds could not be reused, meaning each object was unique. Every vessel, weapon, or ornament was cast separately, reflecting the slow, careful nature of Shang craftsmanship. It was not a mass production system but a ritual of repetition. The artisans who carried out this work were specialists, possibly organized into hereditary guilds. Their skills were transmitted within families, generation after generation, ensuring consistency in technique and style. The most striking of the Shang bronzes were ritual vessels, known as Ding, Gu, Yu, and Zun. These vessels had specific shapes and functions. The Ding was a tripod cauldron used for cooking or offering food during ceremonies. The Gu was a tall wine cup with a flared mouth. The Yu was a lidded container for liquids, and the Zun was a larger vessel for ritual drinking. These items were decorated with intricate designs, spirals, animal masks known as tautai, and geometric borders. The designs were not meant for aesthetic pleasure but for symbolic meaning. The animal forms represented protective spirits or mythical beings, reflecting the belief that the spirits inhabited the ritual space alongside the living. Each bronze object had a purpose beyond its physical form. In royal ceremonies, bronzes were filled with offerings of wine, meat, or grain, and placed upon altars as gifts to the ancestors. Their weight and shape were designed for stability, not beauty. When not in use, they were stored carefully in royal treasuries or buried with their owners in tombs. Archaeologists have found sets of matching vessels arranged in precise order beside the remains of Shang kings and nobles, suggesting that even in death, the social hierarchy and ritual sequence were maintained. Weapons made of bronze were also central to Shang society. Spears, dagger axes, arrowheads, and swords were cast with the same precision as ritual vessels. These weapons were not only tools of war but also symbols of authority. A bronze axe might be used in battle, but it could also represent the right to rule. Many weapons were elaborately decorated, even though decoration did not improve their function. It was believed that a weapon bearing sacred designs carried the blessing of the ancestors and would perform better in combat. Bronze tools, too, played an essential role in daily life. Farmers used bronze sickles, chisels, and knives. Carpenters and builders employed bronze adzes and awls. These tools were more durable than earlier stone ones, allowing for greater precision in craft and construction. The availability of bronze tools gradually transformed agriculture, architecture, and manufacturing, increasing productivity and shaping the rhythm of work across the land. The distribution of bronze was controlled by the ruling class. The production centers were under royal authority, and the finished products were issued to nobles and officials. The use of bronze in rituals was restricted to certain ranks, with specific vessel types reserved for kings and high nobles. Each bronze object had a purpose beyond its physical form. In royal ceremonies, bronzes were filled with offerings of wine, meat, or grain, and placed upon altars as gifts to the ancestors. Their weight and shape were designed for stability, not beauty. When not in use, they were stored carefully in royal treasuries or buried with their owners in tombs. Archaeologists have found sets of matching vessels arranged in precise order beside the remains of Shang kings and nobles, suggesting that even in death, the social hierarchy and ritual sequence were maintained. Weapons made of bronze were also central to Shang society. Spears, dagger axes, arrowheads, and swords were cast with the same precision as ritual vessels. These weapons were not only tools of war but also symbols of authority. A bronze axe might be used in battle, but it could also represent the right to rule. Many weapons were elaborately decorated, even though decoration did not improve their function. It was believed that a weapon bearing sacred designs carried the blessing of the ancestors and would perform better in combat. Bronze tools, too, played an essential role in daily life. Farmers used bronze sickles, chisels, and knives. Carpenters and builders employed bronze adzes and awls. These tools were more durable than earlier stone ones, allowing for greater precision in craft and construction. The availability of bronze tools gradually transformed agriculture, architecture, and manufacturing, increasing productivity and shaping the rhythm of work across the land. The distribution of bronze was controlled by the ruling class. The production centers were under royal authority, and the finished products were issued to nobles and officials. The use of bronze in rituals was restricted to certain ranks, with specific vessel types reserved for kings and high nobles. This restriction reinforced the social hierarchy. Even in death, the number and style of bronze objects buried with an individual corresponded to their rank in life. The poor had few or none, while the elite possessed hundreds. In addition to its practical and symbolic uses, bronze carried deep religious importance. It was seen as a medium through which humans could communicate with the spiritual realm. The gleaming surface of bronze reflected light and fire during ceremonies, symbolizing the connection between heaven and earth. The sound of bronze bells and drums was used to call the spirits and announce rituals. The resonance of bronze instruments was steady, low, and enduring, a sound that could carry across the open plains and mark sacred time. Archaeological evidence from Anyang shows that the production of bronze reached an extraordinary level of sophistication in the late Shang period. Large foundries have been discovered, containing remains of furnaces, molds, and slag. It is estimated that some workshops could produce hundreds of vessels at once, though each was still made by hand. The organization required for such production implies a high degree of administrative control and technical knowledge. The artisans who worked in these foundries were likely bound to the state, their labor part of the broader system of tribute and obligation. It may be said that bronze was to the Shang Dynasty what iron would later be to other civilizations, a foundation of both power and identity. Through bronze, the Shang expressed order, stability, and continuity. Every cast vessel was a statement of devotion, every weapon a sign of authority, every bell a call to ritual observance. The process itself, from mining to casting, reflected the same qualities that defined Shang society: patience, repetition, hierarchy, and reverence for the unseen forces believed to govern the world. Thus, the bronze work of the Shang was not merely an art or a craft, it was a language of civilization. It told of a people who shaped their world through fire and clay, who found in metal the permanence they sought in life and in death. The gleam of bronze has long faded from the earth, but its quiet echo endures, steady, ordered, and eternal, much like the rhythm of the Shang themselves. It was observed that the daily life of the people of the Shang Dynasty followed a predictable rhythm, shaped by the cycles of the seasons and the requirements of agricultural labor. Each day began with the rising of the sun and ended with its setting, and between these 2 points, life unfolded at an unhurried, steady pace. There were no sudden changes in pattern, no significant interruptions. Work, food, rest, and ritual repeated endlessly, year after year, generation after generation. The foundation of this daily rhythm was agriculture. Most people in the Shang lands were farmers, living in small villages along rivers and fertile plains. Their principal crop was millet, a grain that thrived in the dry northern soil. It was hardy, easy to store, and capable of growing even when rainfall was uncertain. Barley and wheat were also cultivated, though to a lesser extent. Rice, which required wetter conditions, was grown further south and only gradually made its way into the Shang economy. The yearly agricultural calendar was well understood. Seeds were sown in the spring, tended during summer, harvested in autumn, and stored during winter. The plowing of fields was done using wooden plows tipped with bronze blades. Oxen or human laborers pulled the plows. The soil was broken, seeds were scattered by hand, and irrigation channels were maintained to guide water from the river to the crops. It was a communal process, often involving entire families or villages. The sound of wooden tools, the soft rustle of crops in the wind, and the quiet murmuring of farmers formed the background music of life. When the crops ripened, they were harvested using bronze sickles. The grains were beaten from the stalks and stored in clay or wooden containers. Nothing was wasted, stalks became fodder, and chaff was used as fuel or bedding for animals. The homes of these farmers were simple and built with materials taken from their surroundings. Many dwellings were semi-subterranean pit houses, dug a few feet into the earth for insulation. The walls were lined with packed soil, sometimes strengthened with wooden supports. Roofs were made from thatch, straw, or reeds, depending on availability. The entrances were low to preserve warmth, and smoke from the cooking fires escaped through small openings in the roof. The furniture was minimal, mats for sitting, clay jars for storage, and woven baskets for daily use. Meals were plain and regular. Millet porridge was the most common food. It was boiled in clay pots over open fires. Vegetables such as turnips, garlic, and beans were grown in small garden plots near homes. Meat was rare and usually reserved for special occasions. When eaten, it came from domesticated animals, pigs, dogs, and chickens. Fish were caught from nearby rivers, and sometimes wild game was hunted in the forests. The diet was simple but sufficient, reflecting the steady and practical nature of Shang life. Clothing was made from plant fibers such as hemp. The fabric was woven by women using looms operated by hand and foot. Clothes were loose and functional, allowing ease of movement during work. The color was usually natural or lightly dyed. Nobles and wealthy families wore garments of silk, which was produced by reeling silk threads from cocoons. This was an expensive and delicate process, limited to the upper classes. The difference between silk and hemp clothing reflected social status as clearly as titles or possessions. Family life was organized according to strict patterns. The father was the head of the household, responsible for decisions and rituals. The mother managed domestic duties, food preparation, and weaving. Children helped from an early age, boys in the fields, girls at home. The family unit was not only economic but spiritual. Ancestor worship was practiced within the household. Small altars were kept where food and incense were offered to deceased relatives. The belief was that ancestors watched over their descendants and could influence fortune and harvest. These rituals were quiet, repetitive, and deeply ingrained in the rhythm of daily life. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, the household gathered around the fire. There was little light beyond the flames. The time was used for mending tools, weaving, or quiet talk. Stories were told, though not written down. These stories often concerned ancestors or local spirits. The nights were long and still, filled only with the sound of crickets and distant dogs. There were no clocks or measures of time beyond the stars and the turning of the seasons. Artisans and craftsmen also formed part of the daily rhythm of Shang society. In larger settlements, workshops produced pottery, bronze items, and jade ornaments. Pottery was made using slow-turning wheels or by hand. The clay was shaped, dried, and fired in simple kilns. Most vessels were utilitarian: jars, bowls, and urns for storage and cooking. Decoration was minimal except in pieces intended for ritual use. Bronze casting workshops, as previously described, were busy but organized, with each worker performing a specific task in the long chain of production. Trade existed in modest forms. Farmers exchanged surplus grain for tools or textiles. Traders traveled slowly between settlements, moving by ox carts or small boats along the river. Markets were not permanent structures but open areas where goods were displayed on mats or wooden platforms. The atmosphere was quiet, without bargaining or shouting. Transactions were conducted through mutual understanding and long-established relationships. Animals were central to life as well. Dogs guarded homes, pigs provided food, and oxen worked the fields. Horses were less common, mainly used by the elite for chariots and travel. Chickens provided eggs, and goats or sheep were kept for milk and hides. The rhythm of caring for animals followed the same repetitive pattern as farming: feeding, herding, cleaning, and breeding, all done at specific times of day and year. The social interactions within villages were based on cooperation. Festivals and rituals were shared, and labor was often collective. When the time came to build walls, repair irrigation channels, or harvest crops, the entire community participated. Each person's role was known and accepted. There was little distinction between personal and communal labor. Survival depended on unity. The elders provided guidance, mediating disputes and preserving traditions through oral instruction. The pace of life in the Shang countryside was slow and deliberate. Change came rarely. A tool might be passed down for decades, a field farmed by the same family for generations. The people understood the rhythm of their environment and lived in accordance with it. Floods and droughts were accepted as part of nature's cycle. In times of disaster, prayers and offerings were made, but the work resumed once the waters receded or the rains returned. It was in this steady, repetitive pattern that the true essence of the Shang civilization existed. While kings ruled and bronzes were cast in the capital, the majority of the population continued their quiet lives, bound to the land and its seasons. Each day resembled the last, and each generation followed the same path: sowing, reaping, worshipping, and resting. It was a life without haste, measured only by the slow, predictable turn of nature's wheel. Thus, the daily life and agriculture of the Shang Dynasty formed the living foundation upon which the rest of the society was built. It was through the hands of farmers, herders, and artisans that the kingdom endured. Their simple routines, repeated endlessly, maintained the balance of the world. Theirs was not a life of glory or change but of constancy and quiet strength. It was observed that one of the most significant yet quietly developed accomplishments of the Shang Dynasty was the creation and use of writing. The written language of the Shang was not invented for art or literature but for recording facts, communicating with spirits, and maintaining administrative order. The act of writing was seen not as creative expression but as an extension of ritual. Each stroke carried weight and meaning, linking the human world with the divine and the past with the present. The earliest examples of Shang writing are found on oracle bones. These were pieces of animal bone, often ox scapulae, or turtle shells. They were used for divination, a process by which kings and priests sought answers from ancestors or gods. The questions asked were inscribed onto the surface of the bones using a sharp bronze stylus. Heat was then applied with a rod until cracks formed. The shape of these cracks was interpreted as the response. The diviner would then carve the interpretation next to the original question. Over time, these inscriptions became permanent records of communication between humans and spirits. The writing on these oracle bones represents the earliest known form of Chinese script. The characters were pictographic, meaning that many began as simple pictures of objects, like the sun, a mountain, or a tree. Gradually, they became more abstract, representing not only things but also ideas and sounds. The language evolved through use, repetition, and necessity. It was noted that more than 3,000 distinct characters have been discovered from the oracle bone inscriptions, and many of them are recognizable ancestors of modern Chinese writing. Writing was not an everyday activity. It was restricted to the educated class, scribes, diviners, and members of the royal court. The scribe held an important but quiet position. Their work required accuracy and patience. They recorded every event, question, and ritual without error or interpretation. Their tools were simple: bronze or bone styluses for carving, and brushes made of animal hair for writing on bamboo, wood, or silk. Ink was prepared from soot and water, ground to a consistent texture on stone. The strokes were slow, deliberate, and precise. Writing was both an art and a discipline. Apart from oracle bones, it was also observed that the Shang kept records on perishable materials such as bamboo slips and wooden tablets. These were used for administrative documents, inventories, and lists. Unfortunately, few have survived, but evidence from later dynasties confirms their existence. It is likely that such documents contain details of taxes, tributes, and food storage. Records of grain distribution, military equipment, and labor assignments ensured that the state could function with order and predictability. The writing was not poetic but factual, filled with numbers, names, and symbols of accountability. The connection between writing and religion remained strong. Every written character used in ritual was believed to hold spiritual power. When inscribed on bronze vessels, the words dedicated the object to ancestors or deities. Many surviving bronzes contain short inscriptions naming the maker, the ancestor honored, or the event commemorated. These messages were formal, repetitive, and formulaic, reflecting both reverence and bureaucracy. To carve words into bronze or bone was to make them eternal. In that sense, writing served as both record and offering. The Shang scribes organized their work with great care. In royal workshops, inscriptions were planned before the bones were carved. The order of characters was fixed, the size and spacing were standardized. Mistakes were rare, for writing incorrectly could be seen as disrespecting the ancestors. The diviner's records show consistent phrasing. Each question began with a date, followed by the subject, then the result. This uniformity demonstrates an early form of official record-keeping, an embryonic bureaucracy built not on offices and forms but on words and order. Writing also served the purpose of legitimizing royal authority. By recording events, the Shang kings created an official version of reality. Victories in war, successful harvests, and favorable omens were inscribed to demonstrate the king's virtue and the approval of the ancestors. This written memory reinforced the divine nature of rulership. In a culture that valued continuity and respect for the past, the act of writing provided permanence. What was written could not be easily denied or forgotten. The content of the inscriptions reveals much about the society. They mention agriculture, weather, childbirth, sickness, and warfare. The questions carved into the bones often seem simple: Will it rain tomorrow? Will the king's hunt be successful? Will the child of the queen be male? Yet these questions illustrate how deeply spiritual belief was intertwined with practical life. Every action, even the planting of seeds or the birth of a child, required divine confirmation. Writing gave shape to these questions and preserved their answers. The scribes, though seldom mentioned by name, were indispensable to the functioning of the state. Their work connected all parts of government, religion, and economy. They were the quiet archivists of a civilization that valued memory above innovation. Their records formed the thread that tied the living to the dead, the present to the past. It may be said that through their steady hands, the Shang achieved a kind of immortality, for their words remain visible thousands of years later. The process of education for scribes is not fully known, but it can be inferred that it was long and disciplined. Young apprentices would begin by learning to recognize and copy basic characters. Over time, they practiced carving and brushwork, memorizing standard forms. The repetition of writing was seen as a moral act. Each correct stroke represented respect for order, while each mistake signified disorder. The writing system was difficult to master, ensuring that literacy remained rare and valuable. The preservation of records was systematic. Oracle bones were stored in pits or chambers within temples and palaces. They were not discarded, for they contained messages from the ancestors. Instead, they were organized according to subject and date, forming the earliest known archives in Chinese history. This careful storage reflects both the administrative precision and the religious devotion of the Shang. It was also through writing that the Shang influenced all later Chinese civilizations. The script provided the foundation for the Chinese writing system that would endure for millennia. The principles established, the combination of meaning and sound, the square shape of characters, the emphasis on balance and form, remained unchanged in essence. Every later dynasty traced its literary and bureaucratic traditions back to these early inscriptions carved into bone and bronze. In the quiet act of writing, the Shang demonstrated the essence of their civilization: patience, structure, and continuity. The scribe who carved a line into bone did so slowly, knowing that the marks would last beyond his own lifetime. The king who commissioned those inscriptions did so to ensure that his actions would be remembered, his authority justified, his name linked forever to the ancestors he served. The result is a record that speaks not through emotion but through endurance. In conclusion, the writing and record-keeping of the Shang Dynasty were acts of faith as much as of administration. They reflected the belief that order could be preserved through documentation, that the past could guide the present, and that the written word could bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. The oracle bones, with their simple questions and precise answers, remain as silent witnesses to a world where every word was sacred, every stroke deliberate, and every record a small attempt to hold time still. It was observed that religion in the Shang dynasty was not a separate domain from politics or daily life but rather its foundation. Every aspect of existence, birth, work, weather, sickness, death, was interpreted through a spiritual lens. The people believed that unseen forces controlled both fortune and misfortune. The role of religion was not to explain why these forces existed but to maintain harmony with them. Through ritual, sacrifice, and prayer, the Shang sought to preserve balance between heaven, earth, and the human world. At the center of Shang religion stood the concept of ancestors. The ancestors were not distant or abstract figures. They were active participants in the affairs of the living. It was believed that the spirits of deceased family members watched over their descendants, guiding them, protecting them, and occasionally punishing them if proper respect was not shown. Families performed regular offerings of food, drink, and incense to maintain this connection. The act was not emotional or sentimental but formal and repetitive. Offerings were made at the same time each day or each season, following prescribed rituals that were rarely altered. In royal households, ancestor worship reached its most elaborate form. The king's ancestors were regarded as powerful spirits who could influence the gods themselves. Therefore, the king, as their living descendant, acted as an intermediary between the divine realm and the human population. His ability to communicate with these ancestors validated his rule. When the king performed rituals correctly and received favorable omens, harmony was believed to prevail throughout the land. When disasters occurred, it was thought that the ancestors were displeased, often due to some ritual mistake or moral failing. Alongside ancestor worship existed the veneration of higher deities. Chief among these was Shangdi, sometimes translated as Lord on High. Shangdi was viewed as the supreme god, ruling over all other spirits and natural forces. He was believed to control weather, harvests, victory in battle, and the fate of kingdoms. However, unlike later religious traditions, Shangdi was not worshipped directly by the common people. Only the king could communicate with him, usually through rituals involving ancestors. In this way, political and divine authority remained intertwined. The Shang pantheon also included numerous lesser deities associated with nature, river gods, mountain spirits, the earth god, the rain god, and the wind god. Each had a specific domain and received offerings appropriate to their influence. For example, when droughts threatened crops, prayers and sacrifices were made to the rain deity. When floods destroyed fields, rituals were offered to the river god to calm the waters. It was a system of exchange, offerings were given, and protection or abundance was expected in return. The rituals themselves were methodical and solemn. They followed precise sequences, each action symbolizing respect and continuity. Ceremonies often began with purification, washing hands, lighting incense, and chanting prayers. Bronze vessels were placed in ordered rows, filled with wine or grain. Meat, usually from animals such as pigs, oxen, or sheep, was arranged carefully on altars. The king or priest would then bow, pour libations, and read invocations. Drums, bells, and chimes marked transitions in the ceremony. The rhythm was steady, without urgency. Each gesture was deliberate, performed as it had been by generations before. Sacrifice occupied a central place in Shang religious practice. The purpose of sacrifice was not destruction but communication. By offering life, whether animal or human, the Shang believed they could transmit messages to the spiritual world. Animal sacrifices were most common: oxen, sheep, pigs, and dogs. These animals were killed with ritual precision and buried near temples or under tombs. Their spirits were thought to accompany the offerings upward to the gods. Human sacrifice, though rarer, was practiced as well, particularly in royal ceremonies. Prisoners of war or enslaved individuals were sometimes offered to the ancestors of kings or nobles. These sacrifices were not acts of cruelty but of belief in continuity, the idea that those who served in life would continue to serve in death. Archaeological excavations at Anyang have revealed tombs containing hundreds of human remains, arranged in patterns that suggest planned ritual executions. Such acts, while severe to modern understanding, reflected the Shang conviction that life and death were parts of the same sacred order. Divination was another key element of Shang religion. As described earlier, oracle bones were used to communicate with ancestors and deities. The questions asked during divination were often religious in nature: whether a sacrifice was acceptable, whether the ancestors approved of a plan, whether illness could be cured, or whether a battle would succeed. Every question and answer was part of an ongoing dialogue between worlds. The process was slow, repetitive, and filled with reverence. The cracking of the bone was considered the moment when the spirit's voice became known. Temples and altars were constructed as physical spaces for worship. These were not monumental in size but functional and orderly. Altars were built of rammed earth or wood, often within palace compounds. Fire pits and sacrificial pits were placed nearby. The smell of burning incense and cooked offerings filled the air during ceremonies, mingling with the sound of bronze bells and chanting. The environment was one of calm solemnity rather than excitement. Every sound, every movement was part of an established rhythm that connected human intention to divine response. The role of priests and ritual specialists was important but secondary to that of the king. These individuals performed the technical aspects of ceremonies, preparing offerings, managing instruments, reading omens, but ultimate authority rested with the ruler. They were the silent functionaries of faith, ensuring that each act was done correctly. Errors in procedure were believed to bring misfortune, and so precision was valued above enthusiasm. The repetition of correct form ensured harmony between heaven and earth. Music and dance were also integral to rituals. Bells, drums, and stone chimes created measured tones that echoed across the courtyards. The music was slow and monotonous, designed not for entertainment but for focus. The dancers moved in circles or lines, repeating patterns that symbolized cosmic order. The purpose of these performances was to create balance, to align the rhythm of human life with that of the universe. The sounds and movements continued long into the night, blending with the flicker of firelight and the steady hum of insects. Death and burial practices reflected the same beliefs. The Shang viewed death not as an end but as transformation. The deceased continued to exist in another realm, requiring food, tools, and servants just as in life. Thus, tombs were filled with objects, bronze vessels, jade ornaments, chariots, weapons, and sometimes human attendants. The arrangement of these items followed strict order, ensuring that the spirit could live comfortably and maintain status in the afterlife. Funerals were accompanied by chants, offerings, and ritual feasts, reaffirming the unity between living and dead. Religion, therefore, was the thread that held the Shang world together. It defined social structure, justified political authority, and shaped daily customs. Every act, from planting crops to forging bronze, carried spiritual meaning. The world was not divided between sacred and ordinary, it was all part of a single, ordered whole. The predictability of ritual mirrored the predictability of nature. To perform the right ceremony at the right time was to maintain balance. To neglect it was to invite disorder. In conclusion, it may be said that the religion and rituals of the Shang Dynasty represented a worldview of order through repetition. The people lived within an unbroken cycle of offerings and prayers, guided by the certainty that ancestors watched and gods listened. The flames of sacrificial fires rose slowly into the air, the sound of bronze bells faded into night, and the quiet rhythm of devotion continued without end. Through these acts, the Shang affirmed their place in a vast and unchanging universe, a universe where every word, every gesture, and every offering was part of the same calm dialogue between the living, the dead, and the eternal. It was observed that all civilizations, no matter how stable or enduring they appear, eventually enter a period of decline. The Shang Dynasty was no exception. Its fall was not sudden but gradual, unfolding over decades through a combination of political fatigue, economic imbalance, and moral decay as perceived by later chroniclers. Yet even as it weakened, the foundations it laid, its writing, bronze technology, social structure, and religious traditions, continued to shape China long after the dynasty itself had vanished. By the late 11th century BCE, the Shang state had reached its final stage at the capital of Yin, near modern Anyang. It was here that the dynasty attained its greatest material wealth and artistic sophistication, but it was also here that the forces leading to its decline became visible. The kings of this later period governed vast territories through a network of nobles and regional lords. These lords had grown powerful in their own right, and their loyalty was increasingly tied to local interests rather than the central court. The balance that once held the kingdom together began to loosen. It was reported that frequent wars drained resources and labor. The Shang kings, in their effort to maintain dominance, conducted campaigns against surrounding tribes and rival states. Each victory required sacrifices and tributes, each defeat demanded more men and weapons. The burden of war fell upon the common people, who supplied both the grain and the soldiers. As the wars continued, the population suffered. Fields lay untended, harvests diminished, and the once steady rhythm of agriculture was disturbed. Corruption also played its part. The nobles, entrusted with collecting tribute and maintaining order, began to enrich themselves. Bronze, once a sacred metal, became a sign of personal wealth. Large quantities of it were used to make decorative objects rather than ritual vessels. The royal court, surrounded by luxury, lost touch with the practical needs of its people. Records and later traditions suggest that the last Shang king, known as Zhou Xian, was particularly notorious for indulgence. Whether these accounts are literal or symbolic, they reflect a general sense that leadership had become detached from virtue. Religion, which had long served as the stabilizing force of Shang society, began to lose its unifying power. The constant repetition of rituals no longer guaranteed harmony. When floods or famine struck, diviners continued to ask the ancestors for guidance, but the answers grew less reassuring. It was believed that the ancestors had turned away, or that the king's offerings were no longer pleasing to them. This decline in faith mirrored the weakening of political authority. When divine favor appeared to fade, so did obedience. Beyond the borders of Shang territory, a new power was rising, the Zhou people, a group to the west who had long been both allies and rivals. They observed the disunity of the Shang and recognized opportunity. The Zhou leaders adopted many of the Shang's administrative and religious practices, yet they reinterpreted them through their own moral lens. They claimed that the Shang kings had lost the virtue of heaven. This idea, later formalized as the mandate of heaven, proposed that rulers governed only so long as they maintained moral order. When corruption and cruelty prevailed, heaven withdrew its support, granting authority to another. This concept justified not only the fall of the Shang but also the continuity of Chinese political thought for millennia to come. The final confrontation occurred around 1046 BCE, when the Zhou, led by King Wu, marched eastward to challenge the Shang army near the river Mai. The Shang king, though commanding a large force, was said to have lost the confidence of his soldiers. The battle was brief, and the Zhou forces prevailed. The Shang capital fell, and the last king reportedly perished within his burning palace. Thus ended nearly 6 centuries of Shang rule. Yet the end of the dynasty was not the end of its influence. The Zhou did not erase the memory of the Shang but rather absorbed and honored it. The new rulers continued many of the old rituals, maintained the use of bronze vessels, and preserved the system of ancestor worship. They even kept the Shang writing system, refining it into the script that would form the foundation of Chinese literature. In this way, the Shang lived on within the culture of their successors, not as a defeated people but as the architects of civilization itself. Archaeological evidence confirms this continuity. The bronze casting techniques of the Shang were carried directly into the Zhou period, with only gradual changes in style. The form of ritual vessels remained the same. The Ding, Gu, and Zun continued to be used for offerings to ancestors. The Shang practice of divination also persisted, though later generations replaced bones and shells with simpler forms of fortune-telling. The moral framework established by the Zhou, linking divine approval to righteous governance, was itself a reinterpretation of Shang religious logic. The idea that harmony between heaven and humanity must be maintained through proper ritual and ethical behavior was inherited, not invented. The legacy of the Shang extended even deeper. Their writing system endured and evolved into the characters still used in China today. Many words inscribed on oracle bones, such as those for king, sun, rain, and sacrifice, remain recognizable in modern Chinese script. Their approach to administration, based on record-keeping and kinship ties, influenced all subsequent dynasties. Their bronze technology established standards of craftsmanship that were admired for centuries. Their rituals of ancestor worship became embedded in Chinese cultural identity, practiced continuously in homes and temples across generations. Even their worldview, centered on continuity and balance, shaped Chinese philosophy. The Shang believed that the world was not ruled by chance but by patterns. To maintain these patterns required patience and discipline. This quiet, ordered perception of the universe would later evolve into Confucian ethics and Taoist harmony, but its origin lies in the repetitive and ritualized life of the Shang. When viewed from a distance, the fall of the Shang appears less as a collapse and more as a transformation. The dynasty dissolved, but its structure became the blueprint for all that followed. The Zhou adopted its systems, and later dynasties refined them. The continuity of Chinese civilization, its writing, its bureaucracy, its respect for the past, can be traced directly to these early foundations. The ruins of the Shang capitals, discovered thousands of years later, reveal not destruction but endurance. The rammed earth walls still stand in fragments. The bronze vessels still bear inscriptions invoking the ancestors. The oracle bones, buried in the soil, still hold the careful carvings of forgotten diviners. Each artifact speaks of a people who valued permanence above glory, order above ambition, and ritual above change. It may now be observed that the Shang dynasty, though long gone, remains one of the most enduring chapters in the quiet unfolding of human civilization. Its story is not one of sudden change or grand drama, but of steady growth, order, and ritual that defined early Chinese life. In reflecting upon the Shang, one finds the beginnings of many traditions that would continue for thousands of years: the worship of ancestors, the use of bronze, the practice of writing, and the belief that balance between heaven and earth must always be maintained through patience and respect. When one imagines the land of the Shang, the image is not of noise or glory but of rhythm, the turning of seasons, the flow of the Yellow River, the slow tapping of workers tamping earth to build walls, the quiet scratching of scribes carving symbols onto bones. Each sound and motion formed a continuous pattern. Through these patterns, the Shang people gave shape to a world that valued permanence over speed, duty over desire, and harmony over change. It was through their kings that both the spiritual and political life of the dynasty were expressed. The king was seen not simply as ruler but as mediator, a figure standing between the living and the dead, between the world of men and the will of the ancestors. He governed not through laws written in stone, but through rituals performed in silence, seeking the guidance of those who had come before him. The strength of the dynasty lay not in expansion but in order, an order preserved by repetition, ritual, and respect. The artifacts left behind tell this story with calm precision. The bronze vessels, the oracle bones, and the remains of palaces and tombs all speak the same language, one of care, patience, and structure. Each item was created not for beauty alone, but to serve a function in the long conversation between humans and spirits. Even now, when these objects are displayed under bright museum lights, they retain an air of quiet authority, as though they still belong to a world that measured time differently, a world where nothing was rushed. The people of the Shang were not forgotten after their dynasty ended. The Zhou who followed them did not erase their memory but carried their customs forward. The idea of the mandate of heaven, the use of writing, the forms of ceremony, and even the shapes of bronze vessels continued for centuries. The Shang became the foundation upon which later dynasties quietly built their greatness. In this sense, their legacy did not vanish, it simply transformed, absorbed into the greater rhythm of Chinese civilization. And so, as this calm journey through the Shang dynasty ends, it becomes clear that history need not be exciting to be meaningful. The story of the Shang is one of endurance, of harmony between nature, faith, and daily life. It is a reminder that civilization often grows not through conquest, but through patience, and that the soft flow of time, like the river that sustained them, continues to carry their memory forward. Now, as the words fade and the story rests, it is enough to let the mind settle into stillness. The fires of the bronze foundries are quiet. The fields lie empty beneath the moon. The ancestors sleep peacefully. The yellow river moves on, slow, silent, eternal.